Everyone for coming. It's a delight to see a full room like this. That's a real treat for a filmmaker. I feel I've been learning more about Cinema Politica tonight, and it seems like a great fit for the series. And of course, it's wonderful to be hosted here by RIDM. I will say I'm pretty sure there's a screening tomorrow, and if I'm not wrong, I think there's a screening on Thursday with the festival as well. So there's also the festival catalogs as you leave, and you can check them out. But being it's this popular, I should also say that the film's being distributed in Canada by a company called Films We Like. I don't think we have Montreal dates yet, but seeing this wonderful crowd, go ahead, go on their Facebook page and demand it. Demand it to come to theaters here. No, but seriously, I hope you'll stick around for the Q&A. I've been screening the film in different parts of the U.S. and different parts of the world, and we've had great conversations. And that's one of the other things that's really rewarding for a filmmaker is just to chat about the film and see how different audiences see it and take it. And so I just encourage you to stick around so we can have a little conversation afterward. I guess that's it. Please enjoy the film. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I remember it from being a kid. I was 11, and for me, for the whole city, it was very traumatic and a public tragedy in a lot of ways. But for me as a child, it was the first public tragedy or incident of violence or incident from the news at all that hit me and hit my reality. And I think the way it hit me as a kid was that I associated with the kids, and the idea that kids were killed and their parents didn't protect them and the police seemed to be responsible just was very frightening. And I think adults will automatically put various contexts around this and various frames that help them understand it. But as a child, I didn't really have any of that. So it struck me, I think, and people will relate to different incidents in this way. You know, you go along as a child in your happy little life until something happens that shakes you up and makes you realize that the world is a little more complicated than the world you're being presented. And this was just happened to be that event for me living in Philadelphia. And then I think it built on it when I left Philadelphia and I moved away to go to college, and I met people my own age from other parts of the US, and it was just so unknown that they didn't know anything about it, other people my age. So this thing that had really stuck with me as a child then was not known to other people my age, and that really struck me as well. And then finally, I went to film school and finally sort of found the tools and a method to try to deal with it and tell the story. Thank you for your question. That is one of sort of the mysteries of the story, and there is substantial evidence that they were being shot into the building. There is no reasonable forensic evidence because the way the investigation was, there essentially was no forensic investigation. They were in there with backhoes and bulldozers before the medical examiner got there. The medical examiner said, "We don't come until you find a body," and they were literally at one point with the backhoe bringing up both human and canine remains up together and just churning it up. So there's some people claim that people were shot outside the building and their bodies were dragged back in to cover it up. For the most part, police claim that they didn't fire back there. So it's just one of those moments in the story that I don't think we can really get grips around what is the truth. So I tried to sort of present it intact in a way that would leave it somewhat open. When I talked to Michael Ward as an adult, he did put on some more substantiation to the idea that they were being fired at. He said, "I could see the bullets hitting the wall behind me." So there is substantial evidence of that, but the full truth I don't think is really available to us. I did.
Oh, you did?
I did. I shot extensive interviews, and then in the editing room, we made a decision not to use them.
Okay. Thanks.
But why?
I was going to go there. Yeah, I was going to go there. Don't worry. Why? So they weren't very enlightening. I didn't feel like anyone had really learned anything. There were no big insights. And then the interviews, so you want, some new, looking back, now we understand, right? We know what really happened in the alley now, but they didn't. Or you want to sort of peel back the surface and get an emotional reality. And that wasn't really available either, or it wasn't much different. James Bergauer was the interview where you really got an emotional reality. But Ramona is very professional. She's a professional activist. She's like a good politician. She doesn't go off message, and her message is not about how she feels. right? Her message is about what happened and you know, her political message. So I felt the interviews from a documentary perspective, or I shouldn't say I felt, the editor when he came on, Nels Bangater, one of the ways he talks about it is I've been collecting materials, interviews, and archival footage for almost 10 years, and he watched everything together. And he helped me see that the interviews were somewhat flawed, but that in the hearings, we had a special potential to do the things that you want to do, move the story forward, provide exposition, provide context, but not sort of let the air out of the tire, not let the pressure out. Which I think, I don't want to generalize, but in most documentaries, when the talking head comes on, it gives the audience a break. Like, you can relax, someone's going to explain it to you now, right? Tell you this new present day truth that's easier to digest. And I thought, if we never do that, then the tension keeps building. And so we saw sort of a liability in the interviews, but also a special opportunity in the hearings to make a film that would work a little bit differently and sort of treat the past in present tense and never leave that past moment. And we thought it would just work differently. And I think there's still liabilities and criticisms in doing the film that way, but we thought that there was a good solution there, so we went with it. I can't say that I really contemplated putting in sort of alternative solutions in the film itself, in the body of the film. And I mean, there's probably other things overtly missing from the film that I considered more than that. But what I eventually decided was films generally need to be about one thing. And that's how they work well, and they don't become diffuse. And I thought if I could make this film with integrity about this incident that happened and bring it across in terms of sort of the human element, that would be emotionally engaging, and that if it causes people to go look at those issues on their own, if it causes them to look at any number of issues or related to, as you say, things happening in our world today, that would be sort of an acceptable solution, and that a lot of what I was trying to cover I thought was less available in the library on the internet, and that if it caused people to go look at something differently or go research the issue you're talking about or other issues that, as I say, are not overtly in the film, I thought that was a reasonable solution, that sort of a film about everything is a film about nothing. So you try to make it about one thing, and then if it causes people to have a certain, knot in their stomach to go figure something out or go research something, that's in a sense a victory. And that's kind of how I looked at it, not only on the issue that you bring up, but I think a lot of issues about context and aftermath and many other things that this evokes but doesn't actually cover. I thought, well, if it sets people out to go look at those things more seriously, then that's kind of what I want. Thank you. Yeah, I never found any footage of the back of the house, that's correct. And in terms of footage generated by the police, you see a good deal of what I found. Now, it's always an interesting question. Who knows what the police might have photographed and kept secret or destroyed? I couldn't know that. But that scene that you see almost completely intact, you see almost every part of that footage. And also earlier in 1978, the black and white footage, a lot of that is generated from the police. The only things that were generated by the police that I didn't use is there was some footage of them testing out explosives, which I thought was pretty interesting, but ultimately there was just no spot in the film for it. But I was, as I think you realize, one of the things that was interesting about the film and interesting about making the film was these different sources and where they come from, and sort of the sense in which every piece of media, you have to wonder, well, why was it made to begin with? What was the perspective? What was the bias? And so footage made by the police was very interesting to me, so I looked for it and tried to find it any way I could, and I used most of what I found. But in terms of what could have been shot that I never found or knew about, or maybe even was destroyed, I couldn't know. I don't know. I worked on this film more than 10 years. And it's more than 10 years. I stopped counting. I don't like to. I think over 10 years it stops to be something to brag about. But I'll say that a large portion of the footage was all at Temple University in Philadelphia, and the commission had not only had videotapes of the commission and their documents, but also had collected a lot of the live news footage, and all of that. Well, not all of it, but for our purposes, all of the stuff they'd collected was at Temple University, and it was sort of in this basement in something they call the Urban Archive. And there was a long time between when I knew it was there and I could kind of go there and visit it and look at little parts of it, and maybe I sort of got to know the different people and who was more liberal and who would let me take a tape recorder back there and who wouldn't, but I didn't really have access to it to make a film. And I fought that battle for years and years, and eventually I remember very distinctly walking out of the archive with a drive under my arm, a big, people make films, a 4-bay RAID, 4 drives rated together, and I had all the footage, under my arm, and it felt like, maybe, getting the big gold coin in the video game or something, and I reflected that it was such a long period of time from knowing it was there to actually walking out with it that I don't know in my whole life if there's been anything that specific that I sort of wanted and then finally got. And it was such a long time that if you think about it, this drive that I carried under my arm, when I first knew it was there, I wouldn't have been able to carry it. I would have needed a cart. Okay, the technology changed that much in the period that I was doing it, that I was able to take it out that way. So that was the majority of the footage, probably upwards of 80% out of one archive. And then the other stuff kind of trickled in from other sources over that period. One of the things that's remarkable about MOVE is they tend to defy easy definitions and easy explanations, and I think that's intentional on their part. So early on, people like to call them a back to nature group. They would absolutely reject that, say, what the hell does that mean? It's easy to look at them and say, well, that's like a Black Power group, but I think they would reject that also. They would reject that out of hand, but I also think it's just notably incorrect. That's not their agenda. That's not what they were about. Was the police force militarized? Yes, I think that's certainly one of the trends that's going on. I think it's very complicated, I guess. I don't think it divides easily into left and right or black and white. And I think that's part of what I liked about the story, was to try to keep that complexity intact and just present it in a way where audiences would have to deal with the overall complexity, that it doesn't in fact fit neatly into these boxes that we like to put things, that Move the Group doesn't fit neatly into those boxes. And in fact, when we put these stories into a neat box, and I think the media is guilty of doing this a lot of the time, it does a disservice to simplify and flatten it. And what I wanted to do, people ask me, well, which side were you on? I said, well, I was on the side of complexity, right? I just wanted, and to a certain extent on the side of the children. But, so I don't think there's a simple answer to what you're saying. I don't have a simple answer for you how it sorts out into our political categories. And so what I tried to do was keep that intact. So I will take your reaction as a validation that worked out. I don't know exactly on those guys, but Mayor Good was re-elected in Philadelphia after this. He was elected a second time, and as far as I know, neither the fire commissioner nor the police commissioner resigned or was fired. The fire commissioner was the only one of those leaders who seemed to, at any point, take responsibility in a way that was recognizable. He, at a press conference, sort of broke down and said, I can't, this happened on my watch, and they died in a fire, and it's my fault, and really seemed to, he was the only one that seemed to emotionally at least recognize what had happened and what his responsibility was. The rest of them really kind of held that same sort of stone-faced
cover up.
Yeah, well, I mean, but yes, but I don't even think that's the nature of the. Did they even acknowledge their responsibility in a personal or emotional way? And the answer is, for the most part, no. I mean, not only were they not held accountable in a criminal way, nor in terms of losing their jobs, nor even in terms, for the most part, of in a human way. The commission was impaneled by the mayor, and that's controversial in certain ways. Certainly Ramona, if she was here, would point that out and say, that's all, that was the mayor's people, and there's something to that. It was voluntary. They had no subpoena power, so everyone who appeared by choice. Ramona did not appear. Many cops did not appear. The cop who actually hung out of the side of the helicopter and dropped the bomb did not appear, and it was by choice. The other sort of threat of this is that they had a grand jury and no one was ever indicted. Some people think that the hearings themselves muddied the water a lot, and once you have everyone on TV telling their stories, it's even harder to get a criminal prosecution. So, yeah, thank you. With one exception, you see all of the footage that I could find of John Africa, and he was an enigma. I think as a person, he was maybe somewhat shy, and then as he sort of grows into this mythic figure, he becomes sort of protected by the group, and they keep him sort of on a pedestal, and he doesn't appear in a public way. So there just wasn't much more. It's interesting. They have a house, and they live in a different part of Philadelphia, and they're still active, they're still intact, they still live by their standards. They would say that they're in a different phase, in an activism phase as opposed to a confrontation phase. In a lot of ways, sort of the cultural tropes that people noted, in a lot of ways, I think they seem less strange now than they did in the 70s and 80s, and they have a lot of sort of quips about this that I think are very appropriate. They say things like, our hair doesn't look so strange now that all the football players wear it that way. And then it's just like, yeah, okay, right. And they say, they used to call us so weird, and we smell bad because we ate raw garlic, and now they call it a wonder food, and raw food is all the rage. And there is a sense in which, yeah, you know, things have caught up to them. And they do seem less odd in terms of their lifestyle choices. And then in terms of sort of being more militarized or potentially violent, that seems to have gone away, and they're more about raising their families and, you know, living a clean lifestyle and sort of, I think, leading by example. Yeah. That I think that history is a little more available in the history books. Not totally, not absolutely, but more so than this history. And so the way I like to pose that question is, you know, what was going on in our country at the time that would make MOVE attractive to a Ramona Africa and a bright young black person, right? That this would be a reasonable alternative. Like, what were the other options? And then to me, from my point of view, that's more of an omission than some other things, maybe one of the biggest omissions. But again, the answer would be if it provokes that for people and gets them to look at that and think about that, I think I'm somewhat satisfied with that. Also, there was actually a film done in the immediate aftermath, 1985, that not only dealt with that more clearly, but also dealt with the racial history of Philadelphia specifically and acts of violence, including other fires in black communities in Philadelphia that were rather prominent. So in a sense, even though that's fairly obscured, I felt as though that work had been done better. But yeah, when I personally assess the film, and I think from a sort of intellectual, political point of view, what's not in there, I feel like that question is notably what's not in there, but I feel like it's not that hard to go, you know, jump on the internet and start to research that stuff and ask those questions. And again, if it provokes that, and then to go broader, I think that also alluded to earlier, there are a lot of situations that don't necessarily deal specifically with racial politics in the United States, but a more general version of dehumanizing violence and people being dehumanized and made other on a grander scale. And I think broadly, if it gets people to think about those things, people often bring up other incidents, and some resonate with me more than others. One that resonates with me tremendously is people bring up the incident that happened on that bridge in New Orleans, where people are trying to escape the flood and coming across the bridge, and they're shot back by police. And that really has a resonance with me and feels very similar in nature. And then much more broadly, people bring up the drone war, where we're dropping bombs, you know, from as high as possible, as far away as possible, and sort of operating out of this, you know, we won't be anywhere near it, but if a few children die in the you know, that's acceptable. And both of those really resonate with me personally. And then people bring up a lot more things. Not all of them resonate with me as much, but those are two that resonate with me a lot. But I appreciate your question. I think it's right on. I mean, there are several films here, and that's one of them that's not told here. So I was down there not long ago. Actually, Al Jazeera America brought me there to do an interview and do a piece on the follow-up. And I was so pleased that journalists were doing, like, not just covering the film, but covering stories like that. So when you go down there today, all the houses are boarded, almost all the houses are boarded up. And you would almost think if you didn't look carefully that you were seeing the houses that were damaged by fire, but you're not. You're seeing the condemned houses that have been abandoned and boarded up. And you have years and years of suits and countersuits with the city, people getting partial settlements and refusing settlements, and you actually have a few holdouts on the block, people that have been there since the time of the fire that won't take the settlement and want the city to make their, make them whole and make their houses whole. And it's just a scar. Like, it's the only way I can describe it. You go down there, it feels like a scar on the city. And not only that, what really struck me when I went down there, I guess about a month ago, was that there's nothing that commemorates the people that died at all. There's not a plaque, there's not a statue in a park, there's nothing that says that, 11 people met their end here at the hands of police. So it's really, in Philadelphia, it's really unresolved. It really still sort of mars the community and mars the neighborhood. It's not a happy answer, but I'll give you another piece before I answer that, which is that Michael Ward unexpectedly passed away only about 6 weeks ago at age 41. And it was very strange. He drowned in a bathtub on a cruise ship. He was on a cruise with his whole family and drowned. And they think it's natural causes. There's not much news about this, but so the two characters that I think in different ways represent some type of hope, the child who survives and James who arguably rescues him. Michael passed away right on the eve of us releasing this film, and that was really just a shocking thing, and again sort of substantiated this thought that this history that seems so clouded and seems to just be sinking back in the fog, now our most direct conduit that we would expect to survive and be around for the 30 years is just cut short in his life in another layer of tragedy. James had a very hard time. James, in my view, and people can question this, but I think he was a good cop. I think he was a cop for the right reasons, and he did things like he was the guy that dressed up with a wig as an old person where people were getting mugged, where old people were getting mugged, and he posed as someone who would get mugged so they could catch the mugger. And losing his place in the police force was incredibly painful for him. It was incredibly meaningful for him to be a cop, for him. And it was a brotherhood to him, and he lost that. And in losing that, he lost a lot of who he was, and he had a lot of psychological problems. He became an alcoholic, he lost his family, and eventually he's actually picked up sleeping on a park bench in Philadelphia, and he becomes impatient. And he told me in the interview, and this is something that, leaving the interviews behind, I was like, oh, I really wanted this in the film, but again, the film turned out to be about, not really about this. But he said, I was in this inpatient treatment and we're sitting around in group therapy, and he was like, as a cop, we consider these people junkies. That's what we called them. And now I had to realize I wasn't a cop anymore, and my way back to even being a person was through these people and their help and becoming part of their community. And I thought that was very touching. He eventually, he started a new family. I saw him, he did a panel with us in Philadelphia, but he's actually, today, he's a high school janitor, is what he does for work. So he never really, he recovered, he reached a low in terms of really his own humanity, and he was able to recover from that, but he was never able to sort of gain sort of a meaningful role in life that fulfilled him in the way that being a police officer did. So it's sort of, no good deed goes unpunished, is I think that part of that story. Michael never saw the film. It was my impression meeting Michael once and interviewing him that he would just as soon never be reminded of this ever. And I think that's perfectly understandable. It's the day his mother died. And although I interviewed him and I was prepared to use the interview, when we found a solution without using the interview, I pretty much stepped away and didn't force myself on him. Also, the attorney who you see sort of vetted us and introduced us and convinced him that this was good to do, but when that attorney passed away, I lost that sort of safe connection to him, and then I really didn't feel like I had a way of contacting him that didn't just poke him in a way that was going to be painful for him, so I refrained from doing that. Ramona and members of the Move family saw the film before I showed it anywhere else. They were generally positive about it. It was emotional for them to watch. Their initial comment was something along the lines of, we've seen lots of things done, but that either is so much in our, in favor of us, or basically on the other side, and none of that ever goes anywhere. And they're, I mean, if you can't tell, they are just savvy as hell. I mean, they're smart and savvy, especially when it comes to media and representation. They're just very smart about it. And they realized that a film like this could go further and have a real power, and they were pleased with it in that way. The best thing about that meeting is I got to meet a guy named Mike Africa, who's roughly my age and was younger than me, but he was 4 at the time of the fire, and he wasn't in the house. And he described the people who died in the house, the children who died, that they were like older brothers to him. And he described trying to get in touch for years with Michael Ward and not being able to get in touch with him. And he was emotionally affected by it, and there was a lot of the story he was not familiar with. And at the end, he came up and he gave me a hug and he said, you did a good job. And that meant just a tremendous amount to me. And I felt like, in a way, even though I hadn't met him, after I met him, I was like, oh, this is the person I made the film for, and that was a very cool experience. And we've stayed in touch, and I really like him a lot. And I really relate to him as that younger person, younger than I was, younger than Michael was. And then James saw the film for the first time in Philadelphia when we screened at the Philadelphia Film Festival. And he really liked it. He shook my hand and he said, you did a great job, you really nailed it. And that also meant a lot to me. I felt like if all those people, right, James Berghauer and Michael Ward, or not Michael Ward, oh, thank you, you're a sweetheart, thank you. A little bit of a cold, so. If all those people accepted it and thought I did a good job, I felt like I could feel like I did a good job. I haven't gotten any feedback from any government officials, Wilson Good and Rendell, any of those people. I have no idea if they've seen the film or what their reaction might be. I would frankly love to talk to either one of those people, Wilson Good or especially Ed Rendell, and get his reaction, but it hasn't happened yet. So thank you for your question. Well, interestingly, I've run across another incident that happened in 1985, this time in Santa Ana, California, and an Arab-American activist named Alex Odeh was killed assassinated in a bombing. He was the West Coast Communications Director for the Arab-American Anti-Discrimination Committee, and the FBI pretty much immediately after the bombing implicated members of the JDL, Jewish Defense League, in this assassination, but it's an unsolved murder today, and today there is a group of young Arab-American activists that are sort of pushing the US government to try to reopen this case and get it looked at, and it'll be a different approach. We want to really spend time with the present-day activists and sort of unlock the past through this present-day experience, and also really examine sort of the nature of activism, and in particular activism amongst Arab Americans in particular, that's really incredibly fraught if you think about where you can take a political stance as an Arab American. It's pretty difficult. I work with a partner on that named Will Humans, who's a colleague of mine at GW and a real expert in communications in the Arab world. But thank you.